welcome. I'm Minna Kotkin. I am the interim or the acting director of the Edward V. Sparrow Public Interest Fellowship Program, and I'd like to welcome our panelists. We have a very distinguished group with us today, and I'd like to give Dean Gerber a chance to welcome you as well.
It's actually interim Dean Gerber, and I have great affection for interims. And I'm delighted to welcome you all today to today's Sparrow Public Interest Forum representing the poor today, poverty in recession times. For over 25 years, the Edward V. Sparrow Public Interest Fellowship Program has been preparing lawyers to work for social justice and the greater good. It has earned nationwide recognition for the support that it provides to students who desire to pursue careers in public interest lawyering, and for its role as a public interest resource for Brooklyn Law School and literally the world. In the U.S., Sparrow Fellows have worked for the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Rights, New York Lawyers for Public Interest, of various federal defenders' offices, the Legal Aid Society, the NAACP, Lambda, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and many, many other organizations. And overseas, they've worked with the Indian People's Human Rights Commission in Mumbai, the National Association of Democratic Lawyers in Cape Town, and the Human Rights Center in Hong Kong, again, just to name a few organizations. The topic of today's forum hits closer to home, and I thank keynote speaker Francis Fox Piven and all the panelists for joining us today. I also thank Professor Elizabeth Schneider, the director of the Sparrow Program for all these years, and Professor Minna Kotkin, who is serving as interim director, as she told us, and all the faculty members of the Sparrow Steering Committee for their devotion to the fellowship program and for their efforts, along with the efforts of students, about whom more in a minute, in organizing this forum. And of course, I thank all of the many generations of Sparrow Fellows for their dedication to public service and to Brooklyn Law School. Thank you.
Now that Michael has said most of what I had to say, that's just as well. I just want to say a few things about the aptness of today's panel, given the background of Edward V. Sparrow, who this program honors. Some of you may know that Ed Sparrow was a graduate of Brooklyn Law School who went on to become a nationally recognized scholar and activist in the area of poverty law, particularly with regard to health law and social welfare. He was a founder of MFY Legal Services and also of the Backup Center, the Center for Social Welfare Policy and Law. At his very untimely death in 1983, he was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, a professor of law and social welfare policy. I've learned today that Professor Piven, our keynote speaker, knew Ed quite well and worked with him in many of these early endeavors with regard to the welfare rights movement. So it's our great honor to have her with us today and to have this opportunity to remember Ed Sparrow's legacy. I'm going to turn this program over to Noor Alam, a third-year Sparrow Fellow, who will introduce all of our panelists. She, as well as a number of other fellows who I want to thank, has worked very hard to put this program together, and I just want to mention them by name. Sarah DeVito, Kira Ewing, Rebecca Gannon, Nora Skaden, Rachel Seeley, Becca Watson, Dana Wolf, Stephen Hasty, Jason LeBate, and Leslie Miller. So I want to thank them all. Let's give them our applause. Please join us after this forum. We're going to be upstairs, one floor, for a nice reception where you'll have a chance to interact and talk to the panelists on a more intimate level. So thank you again, panelists. And Noor? Oh, here you are. Good.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Noor Alam. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists today, all of whom have shown a great degree of dedication to the pursuit of economic justice. Our program will be kicked off by our keynote speaker, distinguished professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, Francis Fox Piven, and will be followed by a discussion including 5 practicing attorneys working in a variety of ways to address the problems of poverty. The panelists are, moving from left to right, let's see if I have this. Edward Barbieri, staff attorney at the Urban Justice Center Community Development Project. Richard Blum, staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society Employment Law Project. Jennifer Da Silva, founder and executive director of Start Small, Think Big. We're still waiting on Sarah Ludwig, who's the founder and co-director of the Neighborhood Economic Development and Advocacy Project. And at the end is Brooke Ritchie, founder and executive director of the Resilience Advocacy Project. I am extremely thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Francis Fox Piven, whose work has been extremely influential on me personally, as well as countless other proponents of greater social and economic equality. Piven's work reflects a preoccupation with the uses of political science to promote democratic reform. She is a scholar citizen, equally at home in the university and in the world of politics. Her Regulating the Poor, co-authored with Richard Cloward, is a landmark historical and theoretical analysis of the role of welfare policy in the economic and political control of the poor and working class. First published in 1972, it is widely acknowledged as a social science classic. She also co-authored Poor People's Movements, which analyzes the political dynamics through which insurgent social movements sometimes compel significant policy reforms. Just recently, in 2011, she authored Who's Afraid of Francis Fox Piven? The Essential Writings of the Professor Glenn Beck Loves to Hate, which reflects the numerous other publications she has made throughout her career. Piven's accomplishments as a scholar are intertwined with her political reform efforts. She collaborated with the late George A. Wiley, the leader of the 1960s welfare rights movement in the United States, and developed the strategy that led to a liberalization of welfare in the 1960s. These reforms resulted in a major reduction in extreme poverty and also precipitated the current furor in the U.S. over welfare reform. She has received many awards throughout her career, including the Charles E. McCoy Lifetime Achievement Award and the New Political Science section of the American Political Science Association in 2004. Her demonstrated commitment to social justice issues continues to this day. With no further ado, let me give the floor to Professor Francis Fox Piven.
I'm very glad to be here. I'm especially glad to speak to some of the Sparrow Fellows at an institution that honors Ed Sparrow. He was a friend of mine. I worked at Mobilization for Youth, which was sort of the first poverty program, and it was my first job. And Ed Sparrow also came to work at Mobilization for Youth. He was hired as a lawyer to do exactly what nobody was sure yet. But it was 1962-63, a time of enormous excitement, energy. I mean, you could really feel the city streets throb in the summer in those years. And Ed came on staff at Mobilization for Youth, and he sort of experimented about what kind of legal services made sense in what was now coming to be seen as a war on poverty that the government was going to undertake with the collaboration of all these nice lawyers and social workers and community organizers and who knew. So what did Ed do? Well, he gave his card out on the street to all these kids who were getting into trouble with the cops. He said, well, call MFY for legal help. And another thing that I remember he did, he was just trying to sort of figure out how could a lawyer be useful in a war on poverty. So another thing he did was he took he didn't actually take these cases through the courts, but he investigated a number of cases of welfare applicants who were turned down by the Department of Welfare in New York City. They had come from the South, as many African Americans were flooding into the cities of the North because they were being pushed out of the agricultural South. And these people had come from the South, and they had applied for welfare. And the welfare department offered them tickets, bus tickets, back to the towns from which they came. So Ed wrote letters on their behalf to James Dumpson, the Commissioner of Welfare in New York. Well, and within a year or two, the mobilization project was under assault by the Daily News. It was being investigated by everybody from the President's Committee to the National Institute of Mental Health to the state legislature to the city administrator's office, because the Daily News said there were Reds on the staff of MFY. That was the ostensible reason that we had to be investigated, that all of our records had to be scrutinized. Well, I actually don't think that was the reason, but it's interesting that one of the two Reds that was finally former communists in one case and former Socialist Worker Party in the other case, one of the two people who were being identified in all of these sort of secret reports to the Red Squad in New York City, the FBI in Washington, was Ed Spera. But, that wasn't really what it was all about. I think it was about the cops who were so furious that those rotten kids were being told to get a lawyer to deal with the police on the beat. And the welfare department commissioner, who was outraged, he actually sat on the board of MFY, and MFY was going to take lawsuits on behalf of applicants for welfare. Well, yeah, that was what Ed was determined to do. And he had to leave MFY after these investigations. I did too, for the simple reason that I wasn't supposed to be there. I was supposed to be working at Columbia. But Ed then created what was, I think, the first center for the development of poverty law. That wasn't what lawyers did. They didn't take cases to defend poor people in their various interactions with employers, with social service agencies, with landlords, and so on. And that kind of legal expertise, that kind of case law background had to be developed. And Ed started what I think was the first center to do precisely that. Afterwards, the National Center on Employment, National Center on Health, on Housing. There were a slew of what were, in a sense, poverty law centers. And also, Ed's little experiment at MFY became, in a very short time, legal services. The anti-poverty legislation was passed in 1964, I believe, a very short time after Ed started passing out cards to the kids hanging on the street on the Lower East Side of New York. Now, the legal services program, it's a smaller program now. When it started, there were 1,800 poverty centers employing multiple lawyers all over the country. In the most remote places in the Ozarks, there was legal services, and they were sometimes the main thing that was at a poverty program center. There might not be any community organizers or social workers or education experts or whatever, but there you found a lawyer to try to put the law to use on behalf of very poor and benighted people. Well, this movement, and it was a movement in the law, this movement scored some big victories in the area of poverty law. They struck down man in the house rules, for example. They struck down residence laws, which prevented people from getting welfare if they had just moved to a state. And since so many of the people who were in need, in desperate need, were people who were migrating from Puerto Rico or from the American South, that was very, very important. They struck down employable mothers' rules, which were rules which allowed Southern welfare officials to declare, without evidence, to declare that this was a time of full employment and that this mother was in fact an employable mother, and therefore she should be denied welfare. And they also, this little army of lawyers, supplemented by legal aid lawyers, this little army of lawyers also secured procedural safeguards for people who depended on government assistance programs, fair hearings before people could be terminated from welfare, for example. And they also, during the sort of the years when the program was strong politically, they also used test cases and class action suits to deliver legal relief to large numbers of people who were enmeshed in the poor-serving agencies that had before this time not been disciplined by law or by the constituents of the agencies. Now, from the very beginning, although I don't think we knew this at the very beginning, from the very beginning, the strength of an Ed Spera or of legal services, that strength was owed to the fact that there was an emerging movement at the back of these legal pioneers. It wasn't them, although they were pretty terrific. They had recognized the opportunity, but what a difference when there is, in fact, a movement at your back. And these lawyers, the ones I knew, they were really attuned to the movement, really empathetic with the movement. They believed in welfare rights. And I can remember, Alan, meeting after meeting, one of the things that movements do is they have a lot of meetings. Well, you'd have meetings, and you'd get somebody very famous and important to come to speak. James Farmer, Bayard Rustin. Well, they might or might not arrive, and you'd wait, on pins and needles. What did you do? Well, what you did is this. You put Ed Spera at the podium, and Ed could talk until whoever it was arrived. He could just talk and talk and talk. And we did that all the time. Well, in fact, this movement in the law faded. It faded as the movement on the streets faded. The Black Freedom Movement and its northern expression as a movement for economic rights faded. And as the movement faded, so did a lot of the interest and enthusiasm for poverty law, but more important, so did government support for poverty law, for legal services, for the sort of legal think tanks that had been created to develop the craft of poverty litigation. All these shrank more and more and more as the movement subsided. Movements do that. They depend on extraordinary energy and imagination. They usually have a life of an American history of about 10 years, maybe 15. But then they fade, partly co-opted, partly exhausted. And so did legal services fade, and so did poverty law fade. And that was a great loss, I think, for American democracy and for our ability to make progress towards social justice. How bad a loss is apparent, I think, from the poverty statistics that the United States boasts today, deplores today. Poverty has been rising in the United States for not just since the financial crisis, but for over a decade. Everybody disputes whether our poverty measures are the best poverty measures. You know, there are so many ways to measure poverty. Not surprisingly, we do it in the most antiquated way possible. We measure poverty by the cost of a market basket of basic foods, your cabbage, your pork liver, your soy flour, and we multiply that by 3 to take into account other costs. That is a sort of old poor law way of thinking about poverty. Most of Western Europe measures poverty as all those living below half of the median income. So built into the measure is a concept of relative poverty. That poverty is not only when you don't have enough cabbage to eat. Poverty is also when you have to live so differently than the majority of the population. And the European measure generally reflects that kind of concept. Ours doesn't. Other people dispute our measure because it doesn't take into account the money you might get from welfare or food stamps. But however you look at it, in the end, I think the poverty statistics in the United States today paint a truly dismal picture. Poverty has increased. If you include the near poor, the official poverty line is $22,000 for a family of 4. If you include those who are just above that line, 1 in 3 Americans are now poor. Those in extreme poverty, those living at half the poverty line, their numbers are increasing very rapidly as well. And it's lots of people. We're talking about something like 100 million people as near poor or near poor in the United States, which, you know, despite all the calls for fiscal austerity and cutting Social Security and Medicare, we are a very, very rich country. It's just that most of us don't share in those riches. So it's bad times again. We made some progress. The overall impact of the movements of the 60s and groups like the poverty lawyers, the overall impact was to reduce poverty for a period. Now poverty is increasing again. So what can be done? Well, it's hard to imagine, although we should strain our brains to try to, it's hard to imagine another period of protest by the poor, such as occurred in the 1960s. That's what made everything come alive. And the poor came alive. But that's what made poverty law come alive. That's what made social workers better advocates. That's what made people begin to think of public health in a different and more encompassing way. We who work in the professions that have something to do with communities and with poor communities as well owe thanks to those movements, because our professions were so improved and enhanced by that movement or those movements. You know, everybody would never, people never said the movement, they said my movement. But what about now? Well, there is Occupy, but Occupy is not a movement of the kinds of people we are accustomed to calling poor. I mean, they are certainly money poor. A lot of them have a lot of debt from college fees, and their future doesn't look too good if they don't have a job. But they're college educated, they play the drums, you know. So, what about the poor themselves? Well, you know, I think that in the last 40 years, the American poor have been subjected not only to program cuts, not only to a shrinking minimum wage, not only to the fact that the labor movement was no longer a resource for the poor because unions were on the run, but the American poor have been subjected to a kind of cultural degradation, which it probably isn't unprecedented, but it is so big and so horrific. From the 1970s on, Republicans and sometimes Democrats have been trying to win political advantage by castigating a group of Americans who were distinguished by their class and their race. And a lot of that was cultural. It was sort of what sociologists call labeling, what we would understand as degradation. Why are people poor? Well, I'm a social scientist, and we know that being poor has a lot to do with what you can earn when you go to work. It just does. Or whether there are jobs to be had. But in this argument that so dominated American politics for 40 years, you were poor because something was wrong with you. Something was wrong with your character. You were poor because, people like Edward Banfield said, because you were present-oriented. What did that mean? That meant you couldn't save for a rainy day. Or you couldn't go to school because you wanted to play all the time at age 6 or something like that. Bad character. You were poor because you wanted to drink beer on the stoop. You wanted to have sex all the time. You wanted to have babies. Something was wrong with the poor. That's why they were poor. And what was wrong was very insulting. The poor lacked self-control. They lacked the ability to think ahead. They lacked any discipline. And they were sexually promiscuous. And they were drug addicts. And they were criminals. I mean, this rhetorical war on the poor was of a piece with the kind of cultural war that sent so many black and Hispanic men to prison for drug offenses. Well, I think the big audience for that kind of argument, that kind of campaign, the big audience was the American working class, because I think it really made people sort of scared about what could happen to you if you didn't put your shoulder to the wheel, if you didn't knuckle under, if you didn't really try hard, work hard. And American workers are now working many more hours than they worked 40 years ago, and more hours than workers work in Europe. I think that was the big audience. It was for an argument about self-discipline being the problem of especially poorer American people, and especially people who were closer to poverty. But the poor themselves were also the audience for this argument. And I think it had a kind of, over time, it was so incessant, so relentless. I know that the people here didn't make the argument, but you don't have any megaphone. That I think it quieted people. It made them feel ashamed. It stripped, for a time at least, it stripped away their capacity to redefine themselves in the face of dominant definitions and fight back. I think it's hard for people to do when they confront such a chorus of insult for such a long time. So, and people, there are protests, there are protest groups, there are organizations like in New York, like Make the Road by Walking, like Fury, Community Voices Heard, but not the welling up of indignation and anger that makes a great movement. You know, we should hope that that happens, and I think it can happen. We should hope it happens because that's what it's going to require to restore a measure of social justice to American institutions. It's going to require to restore a measure of social justice to a country that is now in the lead among countries producing extreme inequality. World leader in extreme inequality. So, you know, way back in the 1960s, a movement helped lawyers turn to the question of poverty law, and their practice of poverty law helped give that movement or those movements ammunition, resources. So that should happen again. Why not? And you know, I think it is going to happen again. I don't know how well it'll happen in the field of law. That's up to you. But I know it's going to happen in other fields because there's no mistake in my mind but that the emergence of Occupy signals that once again the abuses resulting from extreme inequality and broken promises and exposed manipulative and even criminal elites will energize or is energizing a new movement. It began in Zuccotti Park and in other parks and squares around the country. Now it is moving into the neighborhoods, it's moving into the schools, and it's moving into the workplaces. Be glad, because we need that movement, and so do the poor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Piven. That was really illuminating, and it was great to hear a firsthand account of the of Edward Spare and the work that happened in the 60s, and some glimmer of hope of maybe what we can do today. I'd like to open up the discussion with the panelists now. I'm going to briefly introduce each of you and your work, and I'd like to have you speak, once I'm done introducing you, for a few minutes about how you got to where you are today, what drives you to do the work in the way you do, and what sort of limitations you face in your work as you are trying to improve, as you're trying to advance economic justice in this country. So first, we have Edward, or Ted DeBarbieri. He is a staff attorney and a former Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Community Development Project of the Urban Justice Center in New York City. His practice involves representing community-based nonprofit organizations and worker-owned cooperatives in business and transactional matters, and defending low-income homeowners in foreclosure. He's also a 2008 graduate of Brooklyn Law School, where he was also a Edward V. Spare Public Interest Fellow. Next to him is Richard Blum, who is a staff attorney in the civil practice of the Legal Aid Society since 1990. He specializes there in employment law, but before that he worked for many years in litigation and advocacy concerning government benefits, particularly welfare. In the employment law unit, he focuses on cases involving wage and hour violations and discrimination, as well as unemployment insurance claims. He's an avid learner, and he is currently enrolled in a master's program in labor studies at the Murphy Institute in the City University of New York, and he's taking a class this semester with Professor Frances Fox Piven called Labor and Globalization. Next to him is Jennifer De Silva. She is the founder and executive director of an organization called Start Small, Think Big. She's an attorney whose professional background has been in community development. Start Small, Think Big is a nonprofit organization which brings high-quality financial development services and civil legal assistance to residents of the South Bronx. Its mission is to empower their clients, over 80% of whom are low-income and minority women, and to increase their economic opportunities and build sustainable financial independence. We have Sarah Ludwig, who's joined us. She is the founder and co-director of the Neighborhood Economic Development Advocacy Project, or NEDAP. It's a community economic justice resource and advocacy center based in New York City. Since its founding in 1995, Sarah has been an outspoken advocate in the fight against predatory lending practices and has worked with hundreds of community groups to develop organizing and advocacy strategies to address redlining and lending discrimination in New York City and the state. And finally, we have Brooke Ritchie Babbage, who is the founder and executive director of the Resilience Advocacy Project, or RAP, a child and youth advocacy organization based in New York that uses the law to break cycles of intergenerational poverty. Prior to founding RAP, Brooke worked as an attorney focusing on public benefits and child care advocacy and policy as a Skadden Fellow, and then as a staff attorney at the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. She currently serves on the board of directors of Community Voices Heard, a member-led organizing group in Harlem fighting for economic justice for low-income women and their families, as well as on the board of Atlas, DIY, a youth cooperative in Brooklyn for immigrant youth. So maybe if we could start with Ted, if you could just discuss how you got there and
Sure.
go from there.
I'll talk from here. So just want to first say thanks to the SPARE program and to the Public Service Program Office. I would not be where I am today without the SPARE and the support that the program provided in law school, so I'm very thankful for that. So in the next few minutes, I just want to talk about three things, and as I talk about those three things, it'll kind of basically what I do now, and it'll illuminate kind of why I do what I do. The first is what I think is unique about our model of doing poverty law at Urban Justice Center's Community Development Project, specifically working with community organizing groups and movement-based groups. The second is the specific work that I do with respect to forming and counseling worker-owned businesses and co-ops. And the last is some litigation with respect to foreclosure defense that our office has got involved in, and I've personally been involved in the last 2 years. So the Community Development Project started about 10 years ago, and it started with a grant from a congressman in the South Bronx, specifically to provide support to community-based organizations. We're certainly not the only lawyers in the city that work with community-based groups, but I think what we try to do is provide the technical assistance that organizing groups need in order to get started. So everything from nonprofit incorporation to tax exemption to leases, contracts, whatever. That's kind of the starting point. We also do a variety of litigation and research and policy to support the campaigns that those groups are doing. Our worker co-op work got started because one of our community-based partners, Restaurant Opportunity Center, had an idea to start a worker-owned restaurant after organizing workers from Windows on the World and the World Trade Center. Some of you might be familiar with the project. CDP got involved because ROC said, well, we don't know how to start a worker co-op. We need counsel. So our office worked with pro bono lawyers at a law firm and over several years helped put the deal together and close that transaction. I came to CDP because I was interested specifically in worker-owned businesses and was fortunate to get a fellowship to start a geographic focus specifically in the Bronx. What ended up happening is just at the time, the community partners that we were working with, one in Sunset Park called Center for Family Life, was organizing female domestic workers, mostly immigrant women, primarily Spanish-speaking, and their business was domestic work, so house cleaning, office cleaning, childcare, things like that. And what they were starting to organize around was this cooperative ownership model, and they needed some legal assistance in figuring out how to come up with a governance structure and what even entity do you choose. So they partnered with us, and we came up with some useful models. Since then, there's been, after the first co-op, which is called Si Se Puede, there's been 2 others, and some others are in formation also. For me, the interest in co-ops is so basically individuals are doing this work already, how do they do it more efficiently? Another client is a group of female day laborers. They used to stand outside in a location in Williamsburg, and they got whatever jobs could come their way. About a year ago, working with an organizer, they started their own cleaning company. They got some great press through marketing and some social media, great New York Times article, and now they're working 6 days a week. And this is 5 women, so they're working full-time 6 days a week. They meet on Sundays to handle business. And so instead of having to deal with the inefficiency of going to wait on the corner and being vulnerable, they're more organized and are able to increase their income significantly. I guess just also with respect to Occupy, I think there is some interesting work happening, and we've had some connection with some Occupy businesses, some businesses that are coming out of the Occupy movement and are exploring worker co-op opportunities. So I'm personally interested to see how that goes. There's a copy shop that is operating on Atlantic Avenue, just pretty close by to here. So I think we'll see what happens with that. I'm interested in comments about Occupy in general, and hopefully we can talk about that during the Q&A. And just lastly, I'll talk about the foreclosure work. We got into that work in conjunction with a community partner in Queens. Most of the homeowners we're working with are immigrant folks who've been here and in some cases have owned homes for 15 years. And obviously with the financial collapse and the real estate market downturn, there's been an increased need for representation in foreclosure. I think just the biggest challenges there dealing with banks that don't have any incentive to do anything, and an administration that is very aspirational but not really willing to go to the mat for homeowners. But yeah, hopefully we'll talk more about specific issues later on at the reception or in Q&A. Thanks.
Hi, and thank you to the Sparrow program for inviting me. It's especially an honor since Francis Fox Piven has been one of my heroes for a very long time and an inspiration to me long before I met you. And I would just say what I've been saying for many years to any audience that I can get a hold of, that if you read one book about welfare politics, please read Regulating the Poor. It's amazing. And thinking about how I got into this, I actually feel like I should turn over the mic to at least three of the people I see in the audience here who were my senior colleagues when I started in 1990, and who probably have much more of an historical view of this than I do. So I have one of the great things about being at the Legal Aid Society is joining a community of people who are dedicated, throughout their lives to this kind of work, and you become sort of a member in this club that's just defined by dedication and commitment. And I'll mention Susan Sternberg, Les Helfman, and Doug Seidman in the audience as three wonderful long-time legal aid lawyers who are here. I started at the Legal Aid Society doing welfare rights work, and I think of what my Professor Bert Newborn used to say about being the legal director of the ACLU in the Reagan years. They felt like he was the I can't remember the name of the general who led Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. The 1990s, as my colleagues can confirm, I think, was a particularly miserable time to be dealing with welfare politics. We had, starting with Bill Clinton, who ran on a campaign of ending welfare as we know it. Not that it was a particularly good system that we knew, but it was a lot better than what he had in mind to come up with. And then we had Giuliani arrive on the scene. For those of you who celebrate the holiday of Purim, I usually use a grogger when I mention his name. And then we had Pataki elected governor, and we had sort of this onslaught at all levels of government, and a sort of hyper rhetoric of the kind that Professor Piven described of degradation. What I think is exciting was, and then also we had the defunding of legal services, and we also had restrictions imposed that made it impossible for legal services programs that received federal funding to participate in work around welfare, and welfare reform was one of the targeted areas that was specifically in the law, was later held to be unconstitutional, but that they couldn't do. They couldn't do welfare rights advocacy work. And so we, as an institution that didn't depend quite as much on federal funds, was able to continue to do that work, but without. Actually, I remember in one of our cases overnight we lost half of our co-counsel. Susan probably remembers that. And that made it very difficult. And then, of course, during the same litigation, the statute that we were litigating under, the AFDC law, which no one on our side of the fence would have boasted as a wonderful piece of welfare legislation, it was repealed and replaced with something far worse, the so-called Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, passed by signed into law by the personally responsible Bill Clinton. So it was sort of one horrible attack after another. But I think, looking back from my perspective now doing employment law, what's sort of interesting in the continuity, there are a couple of things that are interesting. One is that groups did form. We heard before about mention of Community Voices Heard and Fury, both came out of those battles. ACORN got involved at the time in fighting around workfare in particular. And the focus of these groups was around the workfare programs. One could talk for hours about workfare and as a sort of heinous program, but it is, I think, best understood as a way of imposing labor discipline. Well, first of all, harassment and trying to just keep people out of the welfare system, but also a way of imposing labor discipline not only principally on welfare recipients, but also on the working class, because it's a way of saying. And now I'm just really borrowing your material.
Go ahead.
But I lived through this too, so I have some authority. A way of saying, if you don't follow our rules, if you wind up because of some flaw of your own in this situation where you need assistance, this is what it's going to look like, and it's going to be ugly, and you're not going to like it. And we had at least one welfare commissioner testify under oath at a deposition that the purpose of workfare was to teach people how to show up at work on time and to take orders they didn't like. So it was very much about and this is so reflective of the Giuliani view of the world. You will work under our terms and conditions dictated to you. And what was sort of interesting is our response, I think, collectively as a community was to say, well, if you really want people to have the experience of work, how about if we have them have the experience of unionized labor, with wages and benefits and protections from harassment and so forth. Let's give people the experience of work by having a WPA sort of program with unions involved and so forth. Of course, that was not really what they had in mind. And so the battleground over welfare reform, much of it was around work and about labor, and it had the interesting effect of, in some ways, I think, countering some of the rhetoric of degradation, because it became harder and harder to say these are just lazy, shiftless people, and I'm using that word deliberately because I think there is a racial context to these battles. Giuliani certainly made it very explicit, as did Newt Gingrich. But there was, it was harder and harder to sort of say that these were lazy, shiftless people when you were having them, do really hard labor for no remuneration, practically, and under the worst conditions. We had people who were cleaning streets, on the long side of highways without any barriers from the traffic. People picking up garbage, dead animals in the park without any protective gear, including gloves, and we had a community response. I remember, and the way in which. And there was sort of these coordinated efforts of lawsuits and activism. But really, I think, for example, the deplorable health and safety violations that were systemic in the workfare system were really addressed mostly by ACORN doing sit-ins in the offices of the commissioner. And we brought litigation, which went miserably, and won legislation, which was then reversed by the courts effectively in ways that are very interesting, which we can talk about some other time, maybe later. But it was through activism, I think, and through increasing sort of demand that, look, fine, we're working visibly now. We were working before raising children and doing other things, but now we're working visibly on your terms. Now we're going to make demands as workers. And, of course, the agenda on the other side was really to try to attack the ability of workers to make demands. But they had a hard time articulating that, and we found that there was sort of a new sympathy in some ways in the legislature and in other places for welfare recipients, as sort of an odd silver lining or, response to the organizing around those issues. So, from my point of view, it made an awful lot of sense to adapt a heinous phrase, go from welfare to work in 2006 when I went over to the employment law unit. And I think what we had always insisted on in our work on welfare was that welfare recipients were unemployed, disabled, and otherwise employed in non-wage work, caregiving, non-wage work, workers. They were part of the working class and best understood as part of the working class, and were making demands as part of the working class. And so it is not sort of odd to me that to shift into an area where I'm more officially representing people as workers. And we're now seeing the same kinds of attacks, for example, in the unemployment system that we saw in the 90s, on the welfare system, where there are efforts to impose drug testing and other kinds of requirements in the unemployment system, because, of course, if you lost your job, that means you're a drug addict. What I think is exciting also in the legal services community is that there has been a real commitment of resources at a variety of organizations to dealing with labor issues as labor issues, workers' issues as workers' issues. When I started, I think that our practice was really primarily focused on welfare and housing. And those are, of course, incredibly important areas, and we maintain a commitment to those as we should. But I think what now we're seeing in mainstream legal services programs, employment law units, and units that are focused on workers as workers. And I think that's a very healthy development. And with the advent of worker centers, we have certain kinds of community partners, and we work with unions, we work with worker centers, we work with other kinds of groups to sort of address workers who, like workwear workers, have been excluded from legal recognition as workers. And in fact, there is a group that's been forming called the Excluded Workers Congress of workers saying we have been excluded in one way, in practice or in law, officially from recognition as workers, and we're not going to take that anymore. And one of those groups is Community Voices Heard, which started out by organizing around workfare issues in the 1990s. So I think it's a very healthy development and a very exciting one. And I think we can talk more about Occupy later, but I think that it is sort of, I think there's a lot of hope in my union and among my, in the legal service community that this can give some real oomph to some of the arguments, some of the framing, some of the positions that we've been taking for a long time. And we're hopeful to see that there will be a lot more agitation in the streets and that it is really succeeding in going into the neighborhoods and will be of service to our clients and the demands that they have been struggling to make for a long time.
Thank you, everybody, for having us here. It's really a pleasure to be here. My name is Jenny De Silva. I am the founder and executive director of a very new organization called Start Small, Think Big. We are located. Can everyone hear me? Okay. We're located in the Bronx. We're in the 16th congressional district, which is the poorest congressional district in the country. We started in 2010, so as I said, we haven't been doing this very long, but it's been quite a trip over the last 2 years. So I'll very briefly describe what it is that we're doing now and how I came to be doing this. We focus on financial and legal services. So it's those are probably the two most difficult things to try to provide in a community like this. Nobody wants to talk to bankers and nobody wants to talk to lawyers. So it's been a real struggle to try to have a conversation with people about financial services and products and about legal services and products and what use they have for them and what those services and products can do for them. But our goal is really to serve as a bridge between mainstream financial and legal services and communities that are untouched, really untouched, or at least underserved. There are 57% of our community is unbanked. There's just this entire swath of the Bronx that we're working in. That's like this island where they're less than a mile from the Upper East Side, and yet they might as well be across the country or in a different country. They have so little to do with one another, and yet it's like one stop on the 6 train. So there's just this tiny little island where we're working with people many of whom have never left the Bronx, many of whom have never left the little enclave in the South Bronx. If you try to take a cab, they can get you anywhere around the Bronx, but they can't get you into Manhattan. And you're like, it's the 3rd Avenue bridge. So it's an incredibly isolated community, but it's overwhelming how many resources there really are available in the financial field and in the legal field. And so Start Small's role is to really try to figure out how to bridge that gap and how to bring the services that are most needed into a community that so desperately needs them. I think that there are a lot of organizations that do sort of similar things. There are a lot of economic development organizations. There are a lot of legal organizations. And I think that the thing about Start Small that is different is that we are very client focused and very client centered, and that, I guess that's sort of a term that people use. But everything that we do is done through the client lens. A client comes in to us with a presenting issue, and that's what we're dealing with first. All of the services that we are trying to provide, we're trying to make most relevant to the client themselves in an attempt to empower them to take the resources that we're providing, the skills that we're providing, the knowledge base that we're giving, and do something with that on their own, so that they're not dependent on us, they're not dependent on other service providers, so that they don't have to keep coming back to us. They can be building those. They can be building that infrastructure themselves, and I think that is it's a slightly different model in that lawyers especially are very focused on the case that they're working on, and they sort of forget the case is actually a person. And social workers, they have a case that they're working on, but all of those things are tied to a person with a life trajectory, and this person has opinions and goals and choices that they want to make, just like all of we do. And I think it's very easy for professionals to forget that and to stop listening to the client who really needs to be directing that process. So we try to provide the services that our clients are needing, but always bring it back to where the client is and where they want to go in order to make things most relevant. This organization sort of came about from several various experiences that I had. One was running a youth development program in the Bronx. It was a college preparation and leadership development program, and I worked with a group of 100 teenagers from 8th grade to 12th grade, preparing them to go on to college. And it's a community where 50% of people don't even graduate from from high school. And so talking to kids about going to college is sort of completely outside of their realm of possibility. But we had a 98% graduation rate and college acceptance rate, and I attributed that to the amazing peer network that was built among the students in this program, and their ability to rely on one another for everything. They built a family there, and they knew that they could come to that family for the services that they needed, for the emotional support that they needed when they had questions about anything. That's the family that they could come to, and so it suddenly became cool to want to graduate from high school and want to go to college, and so we were sort of using reverse peer pressure, using peer pressure in a good way, to compel these students to do something that none of their peers outside of this family were doing. And so it was this amazing, it was really amazing to watch this group of students create that for themselves and build that for themselves and be so self-reliant. I also worked with the Lawyers Committee doing election protection work in California, and spearheaded their West Coast operation and coordinated their call centers in California, where we had almost 1,500 legal volunteers come out and staff 3 national call centers. We recruited 10,000 volunteers. You're probably familiar with election protection. One of the most amazing mobilizations of lawyers and volunteers that happens regularly, where people come out. And that's the power of an individual who is motivated by a cause. And when you're motivated by something that you believe in, you can do anything. And so watching people who know nothing about election law train themselves and dedicate themselves and sit there all day was truly inspiring to me. And again, it's going back to the individual and the power of the individual to when you put your mind to something, you can do what you need to do. And then finally, I lived in Cambodia for a brief period of time and worked with a microfinance organization and helped them develop a micro-insurance product. I knew absolutely nothing about microinsurance, but because I was in Cambodia and I was a lawyer, they were like, sure, go ahead, that's fine, because they didn't have anybody else to work on that. And that was an incredible experience, being exposed to the Cambodian history, the Cambodian population, that the micro-insurance, micro-lending field, and watching people with absolutely no choice build businesses and enterprises and support their families because they have no other choice to do it. They're not, if somebody wants to go and open a restaurant, they go out and start selling sandwiches on the street. There's no, there's nothing to stop them except themselves. And then if they don't, their family will starve. So it was an incredibly inspiring experience to watch individuals day after day after day get up and do and go. And so start small, think big is a sort of combination of all of that. It's a testament to the power of the individual to overcome the odds that they are faced with, and it's a reminder to me as a professional, to all professionals, that all of our work always has to come back to the individuals who we are professing to serve, and that we can be excellent lawyers, and we can talk about movements, and we can talk about poverty law, we can talk about all of these wonderful things, but without the people who we're talking about, this is irrelevant. So I think that that's always very important for me to remember, and I feel like that's the way in which Start Small is trying to make its mark, is just constantly reminding ourselves about why we're here and what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're doing it.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi. We all are here, right? We're here. We're present. So you see my name. It's Sarah Ludwig. I work at an organization called NEDAP, which is the Neighborhood Economic Development Advocacy Project, which was founded about 17 years ago in New York City. And events like this are always interesting because it gives you pause and you're asked to kind of talk to law students about how you got to where you are. And it's not always so coherent, and one doesn't, in the midst of one's life, usually, at least I don't, kind of trace the narrative of how you got to where you're going. But if I were to trace that narrative, as I was sitting here, I was, I'll just confess. When I was in 6th grade, our 6th grade teacher did one of these horrible, horrible things. Took a vote in the class of who was the most popular, who was the most athletic, and guess what I won? Most likely to be a lawyer. And I knew even at that tender 6th grade age that somewhere in there it was not a compliment. Anyway, I resisted that destiny that had been charted for me by others, and spent a lot of time as I was learning and being, sort of growing up, thinking about social movements, thinking about social justice and social change. And so it's especially an honor to be at the same panel as you today, because I went to college in the early 1980s, and I would say there was a point at which virtually all my professors were allowing us, it wasn't even an assignment, to read it was an assignment, but the wonderful privilege of reading your work, which made a big impression on me intellectually and otherwise, and so thank you for that. But I will attribute to no responsibility, so I don't want to. What do we do at NEDAP, and why do we do it? I went to law school. I graduated 20 years ago, and while I was in law school, it was the early 1990s, and we were students very concerned about issues of homelessness and housing. This was a time when large parts of the city had just tremendous abandonment. There were tens of thousands of empty abandoned units throughout the city, and there wasn't a sound policy for making sure that people who were at the same time, tens of thousands of homeless people, that they became housed in a humane way. And I started working during law school with a bunch of my classmates, and we started a student-run clinic. The school didn't want to do it, so we did it. And I see someone smiling. Did you do the same thing? All right. So we started a clinic to engage other students as well as ourselves in working on direct service, community education, litigation support, policy advocacy, to really take a kind of multi-pronged approach to issues of homelessness and to engage the rest of the student body in thinking about what was going on right outside the doors of the school, that we felt that a lot of the sort of main current of our class, there were 144 people just in my section and 400 in my law school class, that so many people were just thinking about going uptown or downtown to the financial center or to Midtown to their corporate law jobs. And so we kind of had this righteous notion that we were going to engage the rest of our classmates in thinking about these social justice issues in the context of housing and affordable housing and homelessness. But we started this clinic, and I started working. We did the support of community-based organizations around the city and legal public interest law organizations to get a whole cadre of interested law students to go and work for them and learn from them, but also be available to help. And I ended up, through that process, also working with a group in the South Bronx that was taking over city-owned abandoned buildings with immigrant families in the South Bronx, many of whom had been living doubled up, tripled up in overcrowded conditions, many families living out of cars and vans. And we were helping them basically break into city-owned, locked buildings to take over the housing and, through no cost to the city or the public or anybody else, rehabilitate that housing to make sound, affordable living space for people. Virtually everybody that we worked with worked. They worked in factories, they worked in microenterprise, they did all sorts of industrious things around the Bronx and the region, but they didn't have housing, and then they spent all their other hours working on their homes. So guess what they needed? A lawyer. So after law school, I worked it out to go and work for that organization. And my notion at the time was, the city would show up sometimes with, dogs, police dogs at 9 o'clock in the morning, just as people, were coming back from taking their kids to school, to oust people from these homes with no notice. People that very notoriously, right, your property class, adverse possession, I forget, but whatever. In the city, there's this 30-day rule that if somebody lives openly and notoriously in someone else's house, right, that they are entitled to notice. So there were all sorts of due process aspects to this, and just, this is rational what people are doing, and why is the city out to get them? So they needed somebody to do anti-eviction stuff. I had no idea how to do this, but luckily there is a very strong public interest bar in New York, and there were a lot of older lawyers who were really very open at legal aid and legal services and other organizations who saw me kind of struggling at this organization and taught me stuff and helped me and really bailed me out in dire moments. So anyway, through that work, one of the things that was sort of haunting, on top of the issues that we were working on most immediately, was that going through the neighborhoods that we were working in the Bronx, there was this very sort of impressive ghost town effect, where these old bank branches that have this architecture that's really heavy, right? It's supposed to make you feel like you have confidence in the building where you're putting your money, right? These were all empty. This is before, I guess there was 99-cent stores, or what were they then? But whatever. There were, dollar stores, but they had, there wasn't a CVS everywhere. Now a lot of these have been turned into rent-to-own stores and things like that. But there were just all these empty, abandoned bank branches all over the neighborhood. And many of the families that we were working with, their buildings were underway, they were organized, they had, tenant eviction, defense, chain of communication. We were good, things were going well. We started to think about taking things to the next levels to help the families that we were working with actually get access to non-loan sharking, non-usurious financial products. And here you've got this visible symbol of communities being abandoned by financial institutions all around you, dotting the landscape. And so we took on this whole new enterprise, which was to learn about how we could hold banks accountable to the community using a law that was passed in 1977 that actually requires banks to serve all communities equitably, including low and moderate income neighborhoods. Started doing research, pouring through the records, and we saw that what the banks had done in New York is they had drawn their service areas according to the crudest sort of cognitive map that you could draw of, sort of affluence, race, and so forth. And so we started using administrative law to say, wait a second, these lines themselves are discriminatory. This is redlining. You're cutting off communities. You're saying you don't even have legal obligations to them because that's what your maps say. So that's that. All right. So, moving forward, I started doing this work in the early to mid-1990s, and it became very, very clear that there was tremendous potential in New York City for groups to be organizing around these issues, which they hadn't done in a while. There were such sort of resource organizations in other cities, but New York didn't have one. And so this is part of the audacity of being a young law graduate, is you have no idea how audacious you're being, right? It's like the presumption that goes with, this is what I want to do, so I'm going to figure out how to do it. And the privilege that comes with that should not be lost on any of us. So the next time you start fetching about how horrible something, think about the doors that are flung open to you left and right by virtue of your being in law school and all the tremendous opportunities that you have to learn and to work and to do good stuff. Okay. Not to say it's not easy, but just keep it in perspective is what I'm trying to say. So I started this organization, NEDAP, and it really was in the context of banks denying access to communities based on the race and income of the people living in neighborhoods. The people we worked with couldn't get a $300 loan to fix the van that they used to get to work, right? It just didn't exist. Very soon thereafter, I'm going to start winding down. Very soon thereafter, the work took this 180-degree turn. Because as I started this organization and we started working with groups all around the city and the staff started to grow, the neighborhoods where we were focused with these incredible vacuums became absolutely flooded with high-cost, destructive, exploitative forms of credit and financial services because of a confluence of deregulation and I won't even get into it. Wall Street securitization, people figuring out ways to make a lot of money off of the lowest income people and communities of our city and our country. And so we have, for the last 15 years, am I doing my math right? 17 years, been sort of working with groups to organize against this systematic exploitation of communities, which has helped to perpetuate poverty, perpetuate segregation, perpetuate inequality. And I was reminded when you were talking about character, sort of, if you're poor, that must be your fault, that's a question of character. we used to talk a lot about that again when I was, years ago, blaming the victim and sort of looking at people as their personal characteristics as, the cause of poverty and the culture of poverty and all these issues that, people talked about. We are full circle, but it's gotten, in a way, well, maybe not more insidious, but it's certainly, well, okay, I won't try to characterize it. No pun. The point is that we now, the character proxy that's being used is people's credit. And so we are now engaged in a campaign with community-based groups, legal services advocates, unions, GED prep and job training programs, a whole community-based financial institutions and others to address this really growing practice. And I'll give you one example, by employers who now will, a growing number of employers, check people's credit when they're making an employment decision as a quick proxy, a quick way to assess someone's character. Because if you are not paying your bills, your debts, your loans, not your bills, your loans, if your credit report shows that, you must be really irresponsible. But the way we see it is that our credit system is itself predicated, is itself inequitable. It then manifests itself in communities with groups of people, and then people's credit reports are basically a reflection of these existing inequities that then get used to justify not hiring people, not giving them raises, and there are many, many people right now in the city who are not getting housing, not getting jobs because of that. So there's more to say, but I would like to answer questions about lawyering, because I have lots of thoughts on that, but I talked way too long, sorry.
Okay, hi, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Great. Okay, so I'm not going to talk too long because I also want to get to the questions. But what I would like to do, by way of explaining how I've gotten to where I am, I'm the founder and executive director of an organization called the Resilience Advocacy Project, is talk really briefly about my sort of personal and emotional journey through the law. Because when I was in law school, that's really what intrigued me, was less the things you could read on a piece of paper about the jobs that people had, but why they had chosen those jobs and what, I guess, is that narrative, if there really is one. And so I guess, we all sort of have our Francis Fox Piven stories. My relationship with the law actually starts with reading regulating the poor and poor people's movements in high school and college. So by the time I got to college, I knew I wanted to do poverty law. I didn't have a clue what that meant, what it looked like in practice. I actually went to law school saying, I'm not really going to be a real lawyer. I'm just here to learn the information and the skills, and then I'm going to go out and do the real work of the people that I was reading about. And what a couple things changed my mind about what it means to be a real lawyer. I took a community lawyering class with a woman named Lonnie Guinier, and she stopped me one day and said, you need to stop saying you're not going to be a real lawyer. If you're not going to take the bar, you can say you're not going to be a real lawyer. But you are learning to be an advocate for poor people. You're learning to be a problem solver, and that's what lawyering is. It is creative, hopefully innovative problem solving. And sometimes that means going to court. And sometimes that means drafting legislation, and sometimes it means organizing tenants, and sometimes it means educating children. And whatever it means, you are lawyering. And from that moment, I realized that lawyers have a real role to play in the anti-poverty movement as lawyers. And it doesn't mean that as lawyers we all have to go to court and bring litigation, although that is one tool one skill that we have. And I also, that built on my belief that I developed in reading Professor Piven's books, that the law itself has a real role to play in how we understand our relationship to government and to society. It sets our standards, it tells us what our rights are, it sets limits, And so as lawyers, we're in a unique position to understand the relationship between those laws and what they say about how we live and how we should live in relation to one another. And that's always been really exciting to me. So that was sort of the beginning of my emotional journey. I graduated from law school. I moved here. I thought, where else would one want to practice law than New York? And I went to work at an organization that at the time was called the Welfare Law Center. Now it's the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. And when I got my fellowship, it was the only place that I applied. It was the only place I wanted to go. It had welfare law in the name. And again, that made me very unique among my Harvard Law graduates, that I wanted to go and do welfare law. But to me, when you talked about communities of people living in poverty, one of the clearest manifestations of the responsibility that government believed they had to those people could be seen in what our welfare laws looked like. And I was in college during the sort of tumult of the 1990s, and was interning at Children's Defense Fund and legal organizations here in the city, and couldn't wait to have something to say about the wrong direction that I thought welfare law was moving, and that the responsibility that government feels it has to people most in need was shrinking. And so being at the Welfare Law Center here in the city really gave me an opportunity, as part of this emotional journey through the law, to crystallize and get a more hands-on understanding of what it meant for me to be a lawyer for the poor. And what I discovered, which should not have surprised me, is that my passion was really with children. That I, through my fellowship, was allowed to work with individual clients as well as implement class action litigation, and I kept noticing the children of my clients. And they were not my clients. I was not a child lawyer. I was a public benefits attorney. But clients would bring their children, and we would talk about the impact that losing their housing or losing their child care, losing their job would have on the stability of their whole family. And I kept thinking, if you are so destabilized by the issue we're trying to work on, God, imagine how destabilizing this is for your 8-year-old. Moving from house to house, moving from child care center to child care center, having to switch schools because the homeless shelter that you were moved into is in Brooklyn and not Queens. And I got really angry. I got angry because I felt that I had committed myself to a type of law, poverty law, within which children and young people, I felt, were largely invisible as children and young people. That the relationship between them and the government was mediated by their parents. And I believe that the law should act directly on young people and work directly to prevent the kinds of crises in their lives that concretize poverty, that keep them trapped. And I didn't really see how that was happening. So I am winding down. So I started the Resilience Advocacy Project about 4.5 years ago. And I did it to do two things, to accomplish two things. First, we advocate to change the legal systems and the process of advocacy in the lives of children and young people, to make the laws that we're enforcing and implementing more responsive to youth development, to child development, more preventive in nature. Right now, a lot of our poverty laws don't anticipate or think about children. We have youth laws like education and foster care, but the welfare system system here in New York is very clear about the fact that they believe it is not part of their mandate to serve young people. And yet a significant percentage of the people that seek welfare benefits are homeless young people leaving foster care, teen parents who are at the end of their rope. But because the system doesn't anticipate or respond to them as young people, they lose out. So that's a big part of what we do. The second piece of what we do is train young people themselves to be anti-poverty advocates for themselves and their peers. They set up essentially what would be, if they were lawyers, community-based clinics. But they're resource desks, because we have discovered many young people don't like the word clinic, and they aren't lawyers. They're resource desks located in really disadvantaged communities, run by and for young people, wherein we train teenagers in basic poverty law, basic poverty rights. You have the right to apply for health insurance. You have the right to apply for benefits. If you are a teen mom, you have the right to apply for child care. And we basically train them to be better consumers of the law, so that if we win and the laws are really great, we also have empowered, aware young people who are developing a sense of what their relationship to government should be. So that's what we do. And before we open to questions, I want to say one really quick thing about thinking about lawyering and being a lawyer. One of the things that's been most powerful to me as I have traversed my professional, like relatively short professional life, 12 years so far, is that it's really important to think creatively about what it means to be a lawyer. And it goes back to what I sort of took away from law school. Be expansive in your thinking about problem solving. Everyone on this panel has taken really different and amazing approaches to lawyering and to problem solving. Think about power relationships with your clients and what it means to be a partner as opposed to the expert in the room. And last but not least, think about other ways to expand your relationship to the communities that you work in. I am not an organizer. I'm not very good at it. But I serve on the board and have for many years of Community Voices Heard, because I believe in the power of community-led and member-led organizations. So things like board service can be a really powerful way to expand your horizons about lawyering. So, okay.
We should give them all. I have to say, I very self-interestedly invited all of you here because a lot of us that are in the public interest program, are really eager to, get our hands dirty and do the work, and knowing how much experience you all have and having this sort of dialogue with you has been really inspirational, and makes me think that maybe there's a way that, there may be a movement brewing. I'd like to give the opportunity to open this up to our guests. I'm sure I have lots of questions, but I'm going to open it up to the audience first. Professor Gasso?
Professor Watzke, when you talked a bit about the U.S.'s dubious distinction of being one of the centers of inequality, and one of the other, perhaps even more depressing things is that we're also a center of inequality of opportunity, right? So I think there was an article earlier this year about how now it's harder to advance intergenerationally in the U.S. than in Europe, right? And a lot of this goes into these cycles, these neighborhoods that lack social capital and all these different kinds of resources. And I was wondering what you and other panelists think about how to address that through a social movement or through law, not necessarily just an individual's employment situation, but how these whole communities are really under-resourced so that kids are born with very little chances of advancing.
Well, I think that you're right. There is the United States has in the past justified high levels of inequality by arguing that we have greater opportunities for mobility in the United States. Whether that was true in the past can be debated, and I would debate it. I would raise some queries about the usual depictions of mobility in the United States. But it is very, very clear that the United States now is a low mobility society combined with extreme inequality. Well, I think your question is, you could be asking, well, what can we do tomorrow? Can I form my organization and ask you guys to help? to solve the problem. Or you might be asking whether, not how to get from here to there, but is there a there? Is there a way of organizing a society and its economic functions that would be more egalitarian, that would cultivate human capacities for freedom and development? Clearly, the answer to the second question is of course. And the way to cultivate human capacities while reducing inequality is not just to put everybody to work in service stations, for example. You know, we could get rid of those self-serve gasoline pumps, and so everybody could get a job pumping gas. Well, yeah, we could do that, and we could stop asking people to check out their own groceries and things like that. A lot of things we could do just to create jobs. But I think we should aspire to create a kind of human freedom, although I'm very wary of the word freedom since the right has started to use it as meaning economic license. But, I mean, why does everybody have to work so much? I'm asking you, people are working not only 40 hours a week, they're working 50 hours a week. Couples are putting in much more time than they did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And they're working more, Americans work much more than Europeans do. Do you know that Europeans take a month off, aside from having a shorter work week? We don't do that in the United States. They also have so many holidays in Europe. So, let's redistribute not only the wealth and the income, but let's redistribute the work so that people put in less time. They have more time for the children or more time to dabble in watercolors or gardening. People should have some time. We can make let's make all schools free. I think that would be a good idea. All higher education and middle schools and so forth would be free, and people could go to them at any time in their lives. And we'll be able to do it because we've solved the job problem, right? So there'll be a lot of people who will want to work in those schools. Anyway, yes, of course, there's a better way of organizing a society. Come on.
I'd like to add to that really briefly. I don't think that we can, as a society, talk seriously about breaking cycles of intergenerational poverty without rethinking our child-relevant laws. I think that right now, and funding priorities. I mean, if you look at the city budget this year, it's almost zeroed out all services that could be reasonably considered to be preventive in nature. And education laws and policies are getting worse, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if you really are talking about breaking cycles, you have to invest in the people who are going to be the workers and the parents in the next generation. And our laws don't do that. They're very crisis-focused and crisis-driven. And so I think there needs to be sort of a fundamental reshaping of the relationship between the law and children in particular.
There are a whole bunch of us.
Yes.
I totally agree with that, and I think it's not just a reshaping of the relationship between the law and the individual, but the relationship between programs and the people who they serve. And I think that stems from where the money comes from and how programs are funded. Programs are funded to deal with crises because you can measure your results of your ability to solve a crisis, but how do you measure your results of a long-term relationship with somebody? So I think it's fundamentally about redefining the terms of our relationships, whether they be between programs and the people who we serve, or the law and the people who the law is supposed to protect.
Yeah.
lawyers feel very comfortable talking about rights, and that's something which people who do the work that we do can pitch to our boards comfortably. We get shy sometimes about talking about power, and that's really the key to the answer, I think, to your question, that we need to do work which helps facilitate power in the working class. I mean, we can only play a small role in that. I don't mean to make us sound so important. We can play some role in it, and we can think about how we structure our work to do that. But it's really the answer to the problem really lies in working class power and mobilizing it in an effective way.
Yeah, can I just? So it's interesting because I know we're at NEDAP, we focus on neighborhoods and neighborhood groups and helping groups build power because we believe that where you live has so much impact and influence on your prospects in your life. But we struggle with the sort of contradiction there because it's sort of, saying the onus is on the least resourced groups that are grassroots in very low-income neighborhoods to somehow be addressing structural problems that, are massive. And so I just want to kind of put that out there, that contradiction exists. That doesn't mean and the other thing is that in terms of becoming public interest lawyers and thinking about those of you who are in law school right now, we work with a lot of people. We have, and you were saying you're self-interested in this panel. This is also for us a kind of thinly veiled recruitment forum. No, just you should think about opportunities out there. But do you work in the placement office? You're director of program. Right. Okay. Anyway, but what I was going to say is that we work with a lot of law students who have a kind of, and I want to disparage, so I'll just say this straight up. This is not a disparagement, but it's more of a way of seeing an assessment, which is that have a kind of social work notion of lawyering, kind of legal services in a vacuum ideal, that they're going to do a kind of benevolent lawyering that helps one person or family at a time deal with a horrible situation. And obviously that's really important. We need people to help guide people and navigate their way. Our model is we're helping people do it themselves. That's very important to us. But I would also say and encourage you really to think about vision. What kind of world do we want to live in? What are we working towards? I mean, it's what's the context in which we're doing our work, and to be driven and motivated by a very different sense of what it's about that we're doing, not just individually but collectively. And I think that a lot of people that we work with, particularly, there's a lot of us in law school, coming out of law school, want to do public interest lawyering. You talk about what motivates you. What kind of world do you want to live in? And maybe you're working on that minutia, that section symbol that you like to put into. But sort of like I'm going into the regulation, I'm doing this administrative lawyering, and you got to be able to straddle that. It seems to me, to handle the fine, granular details so that you can be a zealous, effective advocate, but in a context of a broader vision that you're thinking about and pining for. That's not really an answer to your question, but it reminded me.
It sounded great.
No, it reminded me of,
Do we have others? Sure. I think you're right. Oh.
This kind of relates to what you were just talking about. I feel like the places that I've interned since I've been in law school, what I keep seeing are increasing need and decreasing resources. So I guess I'm curious about kind of the role that collaboration, a couple of you have touched on this, the role that collaboration has played in kind of trying to use resources more effectively, whether kind of within your own organization or with one another.
I have a lot to say about that as a new organization. We have a budget of like $3. So anytime that we can get free stuff from other organizations or partner with other organizations from a budgetary perspective, we are totally about that. But also it just makes sense because we are a new organization and we don't have time to reinvent the wheel, and we're trying to make our way. And so we have to do that along with everybody else who's out there. So we get free space because we are co-located at an organization that has been in this community for 50 years. And we use that to get free space. But we also use that because that gives us entree into their client population, so that we can work with this organization to market our services and do outreach through them. And then all of our programs and services are done in a collaborative way, where we don't have a marketing budget, we don't have an outreach budget. So we partner with other organizations, and I talk to my counterparts at other organizations, and then they talk to their clients about the programs and services that we provide, which is, one, cheaper, and two, much more effective, because the mouthpiece is then coming from a person who the clients know and trust, and so it's a much more direct way of working with people. So for us, we in the last 2 years, we've gotten over $500,000 of pro bono and in-kind services. So we absolutely depend upon that collaborative model to do our work.
I think we have time for one more question, and let's give it to Liz. Okay, we'll take two then. Okay. Come.
Professor Pittman, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the use of social media for fostering social movements and for exercising power at a grassroots level. Recent example was, to me, the reversal of the Susan G. Komen Foundation's decision to stop funding Planned Parenthood. That movement seemed to me, I'm not naive to think this, very organic. It wasn't the top-down organizations were organizing people to do it. It was responses to people, to Susan G. Komen Foundation's decision in emails, in Facebook posts. So it seems to me that there's a potential. Do you have thoughts about how that can be used?
I think it is being used. For example, the Arab Spring was promoted, diffused through a variety of social media, especially, I'm told, Twitter. The people in the Occupy movement are very oriented towards social media, and groups like Adbusters, which is, like all movements, Occupy has different parts that aren't necessarily coordinated. There isn't it's the diversity of the penumbra of the movement that gives it its scale and some of its power. So, yes, the increase in communication. I do continue to think that people need face-to-face communication as part of that, so that, the labor movement, if you wanted to know where the movement was today, you go to the picket line, you could find them physically. They were there. You could talk to them. That was the advantage of the occupations, that you knew if you went to Zuccotti Park, you could find Occupy. And sometimes you could find them at Tompkins Park and sometimes at Washington Square Park. So as a complement to the face-to-face character of the movement, definitely, I think social media are very, very important. There is another aspect to internet communications, which is also relevant to the movement and to movement strategies and tactics, and that is hacking. There are groups in the movement that are going to hack. They're going to try to get secrets. They're going to try to shut things down. And I don't want to, I myself would not pass a blanket judgment about that. I think that can be a part of movement strategies. But like any kind of disruptive strategy, it has to be thought through rather carefully. Was there another? Did you have another question? Oh, okay.
Well, I do have a question. First, I just want to say how unbelievably inspiring this panel has been, and how when we begin to think about when we were trying to figure out how to give a title to this program, we struggled about whether or not to call it poverty law or recession times. I mean, those definitional questions were high on our mind. Now, I wonder what you think about the way that Occupy has reset, in a sense, those dimensions by saying the 99%. Because one of the things that I think was implicit in a number of aspects of what some of you spoke about was, and the reluctance of people to want to identify as poor. I mean, the enormous pressure on people who would like to believe, because of the class structure in this country, et cetera, et cetera. I think you all know what I'm talking about. So, Sarah, when you mentioned credit worthiness, that's really important because the whole half emphasis on buying your own home, and regardless if you had no money, is very relevant. Has that redefinition of the 1% versus the 99% had any impact in terms of the ways that we can shape strategies as activists, as lawyers, etc.?
That's a question for me?
No, a question for all of you.
Okay. But they're all looking at me. Well, I think that the slogan, "We are the 99%," was a brilliant move on the part of Occupy. They've been, in a number of ways, extraordinarily clever about the sort of communications dimension of their movement. And we are the 99%. We are occupying Wall Street, also very, very smart. An occupation has sticking power. Everybody knows the demonstration is over. And they weren't on Wall Street. They were at Zuccotti Park, 4 blocks north. Anyway, they called it Wall Street. Very smart. But I do think that for the movement to be a true social justice movement, it has to explicitly include the poor front and center as the poor. Now, I'm the one today who said that the American poor have been subjected to the terrors of sort of total humiliation for 40 years. But don't misunderstand me. I think people have the capacity to turn that around, and that they don't depend on others to turn it around. They may like to have allies in turning it around, but people have an enormous capacity to say, I am right, I have no reason to be ashamed, you are the one who should hang your head, and that you are the one who brought this country to the stage of financial crisis. You are the one who created so much poverty. You are the one who put millions of men and women in jail, destroying their lives. People have the capacity to do that no matter what the propaganda machine of the ruling class says. But they can do it best if they are in a movement where they have friends and allies and an echo chamber. So I look forward to the transformation of the American poor as a result of the transformation of the milieu in which they live and as a result of their participation in the movement. We have a way of thinking about ideology, ideas, and movements, which I think is wrong. We think that first people get their heads straightened out so they have the right ideas, and then they join the movement. I don't think it happens in that linear way. I think that, something happens, they see the movement, they notice it, they attach themselves, and the movement transforms people and transforms their ideas. So Already, Occupy is becoming a much broader movement. It is in the neighborhoods. It is in the workplaces. So Occupy needs the poor, and the poor need Occupy.
And with that, I think we should give another round of thanks to this wonderful panel. So I hope you'll join us upstairs for wine and cheese or whatever else there is up there and more informal conversation. Thank you.
That was really good.